Inflation was supposed to be temporary. That was the promise. A short-term spike, a passing headache, something that would fade as supply chains healed and the world went back to normal. But here we are. Groceries still feel expensive. Rent still bites. Insurance, energy, healthcare, everything seems to creep higher, month after month. And now, the IMF is saying what many people already feel in their wallets. Inflation isn't going away anytime soon. This isn't a quick detour. It's a long road. To understand why, we need to stop looking at inflation like a single problem and start seeing it as a chain reaction that began years ago and is still unfolding. For more than a decade after the global financial crisis, the world lived in an unusual economic environment. Interest rates near zero, cheap money everywhere. Governments could borrow endlessly. Companies could survive without profits, and asset prices, from homes to stocks, kept rising. Low inflation became the norm. Central banks worried more about prices rising too slowly than too fast. Then the pandemic hit. Governments across the US, UK, Australia, and beyond opened the fiscal floodgates. Trillions were injected into the economy almost overnight. This wasn't reckless. It was necessary. The goal was simple: prevent total economic collapse. But there was a catch. You can't shut down global production, pump massive amounts of money into the system, and expect prices to stay calm. Too much money started chasing too few goods. Supply chains snapped. Labor markets froze, then overheated. Inflation wasn't born in 2022. It was planted in 2020. And just as the world tried to stabilize, another shock arrived. War. Russia's invasion of Ukraine sent energy and food prices soaring. Europe felt it immediately, but the ripple effects hit everyone, from American gas stations to Australian supermarkets. Energy is the foundation of modern economies. When it gets expensive, everything built on top of it follows. Central banks responded the only way they know how: raising interest rates. Fast, aggressively. The idea was to slow demand, make borrowing more expensive, cool the economy before inflation became entrenched. But here's the problem the IMF is warning about. Inflation today isn't just demand-driven anymore. Yes, consumers are still spending, but a growing share of inflation now comes from structural forces, forces that interest rates can't easily fix. Take labor. Across developed economies, the workforce is shrinking. Populations are aging. Fewer workers are supporting more retirees. That gives workers more bargaining power, especially in essential sectors like healthcare, logistics, and construction. Higher wages aren't a bad thing. But when productivity doesn't rise at the same pace, higher wages mean higher prices. Then there's deglobalization. For decades, inflation stayed low because companies could produce goods wherever it was cheapest. China, Southeast Asia, Eastern Europe. Efficiency was king. Now that model is breaking. Geopolitics, trade wars, and national security concerns are forcing companies to bring production closer to home. Reshoring and friendshoring sound good, but they are expensive. Manufacturing in the US, UK, or Australia costs more. Higher labor costs, higher regulation, higher energy prices. Those costs don't disappear. They show up on price tags. Climate change adds another layer. Extreme weather disrupts food production. Floods, droughts, heat waves. These aren't rare events anymore. They create supply shocks that push prices higher and make inflation more volatile. Insurance premiums rise. Food prices spike. Governments spend more on disaster recovery, adding pressure to already stretched budgets. And then there's debt. Public debt across advanced economies is at historic highs. Governments are paying more interest just to service what they already owe. That limits their ability to fight inflation without hurting growth. Central banks are trapped in a narrow corridor. Raise rates too much, and they risk triggering recessions, financial instability, or housing market crashes. Ease off too early, and inflation becomes embedded in expectations, where businesses raise prices simply because they expect everyone else to do the same. This is the long pain the IMF is talking about. Not runaway hyperinflation, but stubborn, sticky inflation that refuses to go back to the old 2% world we were used to. A world where prices don't explode, but also don't calm down. And the hardest part? This kind of inflation doesn't feel dramatic. It feels exhausting. It slowly erodes purchasing power. It forces households to make trade-offs. It reshapes politics, wages, housing, and even social trust. In the next part, we'll look at what the IMF thinks comes next, who actually pays the price for long-term inflation, and why this era could permanently change how money, work, and living standards function across the US, UK, and Australia. What makes this period different isn't just how long inflation may last. It's who ends up carrying the burden. Because inflation doesn't hurt everyone equally. If you own assets, property, stocks, businesses, inflation can actually protect you. Asset prices tend to rise with inflation over time. Debts shrink in real terms. Fixed-rate mortgages become easier to manage as wages slowly climb. But if you rely mostly on wages, things look very different. For millions of households across the US, the UK, and Australia, paychecks have risen, but not fast enough. Real purchasing power is still under pressure. Essentials take up a bigger share of income, leaving less room to save, invest, or plan ahead. This is where inflation quietly becomes political. When people feel like they're working just as hard but falling behind, trust erodes. Trust in institutions, in central banks, in governments. The IMF is deeply concerned about this dynamic because prolonged inflation reshapes public expectations. Once people stop believing prices will stabilize, behavior changes. Workers demand higher wages preemptively. Businesses raise prices earlier and more aggressively. Landlords lock in higher rents. Governments face pressure to spend more to ease the pain. This feedback loop is extremely hard to break, and central banks know it. That's why interest rates have stayed higher for longer, even as growth slows and recession fears linger. The message is clear. Credibility matters more than comfort right now. But there's a cost. Higher rates don't just slow inflation, they slow everything. Business investment weakens. Housing markets cool. Consumers pull back. Governments face rising debt servicing costs, forcing difficult budget choices. In countries like the UK and Australia, where household debt is high and variable rate mortgages are common, rate hikes hit fast and hard. In the US, long-term fixed mortgages provide some insulation, but credit cards, car loans, and commercial real estate still feel the pressure. This is the balancing act policymakers are struggling with, fighting inflation without breaking the system. The IMF's warning isn't about panic, it's about realism. The world is transitioning into a new economic era, one with higher baseline inflation than the pre-pandemic norm. Not 1970s-style chaos, but not the ultra-low inflation comfort zone either. So what does adaptation look like? For governments, it means accepting tough trade-offs, spending more efficiently, reforming tax systems, investing in productivity, because productivity growth is one of the few long-term solutions that can support higher wages without fueling inflation. For central banks, it means clearer communication and patience. Inflation won't fall in a straight line. There will be setbacks. Markets will overreact. But consistency is key. For businesses, it means adjusting strategies built on cheap money. Profitability matters again. Pricing power matters. Efficiency matters. And for individuals, it means something more personal and more uncomfortable. The old assumptions may no longer hold. Savings sitting idle lose value. Career choices matter more. Skills that remain scarce become more valuable. Financial planning becomes less about growth at any cost and more about resilience. This doesn't mean the future is bleak, but it does mean it's different. The IMF's core message is simple. The inflation shock isn't a temporary storm. It's a climate shift. And pretending otherwise only makes the adjustment more painful. History shows that economies do adapt. New systems emerge. Productivity eventually catches up. But the transition phase is rarely smooth, and it often exposes inequalities that were already there. The question isn't whether inflation will disappear completely. The question is whether societies can manage it without losing stability, trust, and long-term growth. And that challenge won't be solved in a single quarter, or even a single political cycle. It will define this decade. If this breakdown helped you see inflation differently, not just as numbers, but as a structural shift, then make sure you're subscribed. These changes are reshaping markets, politics, and everyday life, and we'll keep unpacking what they really mean without the noise. Drop your thoughts in the comments. How is inflation changing decisions in your own life? And if you want deeper, clearer analysis like this, you know what to do.